Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us for our Bazalgette Lecture. For those that don't know me, I'm Maggie Ray, President of the Faculty of Public Health, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this important event. I'm so pleased you've found the time today to join us, and I think we're in for a real treat. Just before I carry on, I'd like us to move to the next slide, please, if I may. So this is a picture of Professor Chris Whitty. And the reason we've got a picture of Chris is because, unfortunately, we don't have Chris with us today. We got a message from Chris earlier, and he's very sorry to have to give his apologies. He unfortunately was summoned to a meeting with the Prime Minister. If for any reason he can escape from that meeting with the Prime Minister, he's promised to join, and he's asked me to make sure that he gets a recording of this event, Sir Stephen, because he was incredibly disappointed to miss it. So if I may, Stephen, I'd like to carry on and do the introduction for your Bazalgette Lecture. Thank you. So the Faculty of Public Health recognises the public good which results from translation of their members from public health research into services, infrastructure and the environment established in the Bazalgette Professorship in 2019. That's what we were seeking when we put out the call for the Bazalgette Professorship in 2019. The award commemorates and seeks to maintain the traditions of Joseph Bazalgette, Chief Engineer to London's Metropolitan Board of Works in the mid-19th century, who through his design of efficient sewage system did much to eradicate cholera across the city. Throughout this work, Bazalgette continued to train young civil engineers and provide independent advice to other British towns and cities, as well as places as far apart as Budapest and Mauritius. This award was introduced in 2019 to recognise fellows of the Faculty of Public Health who have made major contributions to public health practice or policy through the translation of their research into practice. The 2020-21 holder of the Bazalgette Professorship is Sir Stephen Holgate. So it's a great privilege and pleasure to welcome you tonight, Sir Stephen. Stephen Holgate, as many of you will know Stephen, and I'm sure I'd be surprised if anyone on this call didn't know Stephen, is a professor at the University of Southampton. Stephen has a fantastic stature of international research and in the UK, and has had an extraordinary career. After qualifying in medicine in London, he pursued research into the mechanisms of asthma and allergy. His work has resulted in 1,000 publications. He was a member of the Royal Commission of Environmental Pollution, founding chair of the DH Committee on Medical Effects of Air Pollutants, chair of the Hazardous Substances Advisory Committee, and the list goes on and on and on. And I've asked Stephen if there's anything particular he would like to add, then I'm very, very grateful if he can. It's a real pleasure to introduce Stephen, and I was absolutely delighted that Stephen was the recipient of this award. I think being able to do research is amazing, but isn't it wonderful to be able to put research into action and really see the differences in people's lives and the health outcomes? So thank you so much for accepting this award. Thank you for joining us tonight, Sir Stephen, and I'd like to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Ray, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And can I add my thanks to your joining this talk this evening? I really do appreciate it. So I'm going to share my screen now. I hope something is coming up, because you know how it is with these. Is that okay? Can you see that?
Absolutely perfect, Stephen.
Thank you very much. No, well, you know how it is with these Zooms. Sometimes things just disappear completely. Anyway, So in thinking a bit about this topic for the Bazalgette lecture, I wanted to try and sort of frame it in a way that places modern medicine and modern public health in the context of the history of where we've come from. Air pollution obviously is an area that's interested me personally because I'm a respiratory physician and have spent my career, as Professor Ray said, researching asthma. So that really is a reason, I suppose, I've chosen clean air. So let me begin by just recognizing what an amazing man Joseph Bazalgette was. And Professor Ray has given you a nice summary of his contributions, but it really was absolutely amazing to think that back in 1850s, he was orchestrating the building of this incredible network of sewers in London, which stood the test of time. I mean, they're only now being replaced. And when you think how long they've been there and what they've carried in them over this last 100 years or more, it is extraordinary. So he truly was an amazing person. And of course, it's clean water really was what he was all about. Hence the title of my talk, which is Clean Air. And of course, the clean water that relates to Bazalgette's sewage project all stemmed originally from the wonderful epidemiology that John Snow undertook in the 1850s when he identified the cholera outbreak in central London linked to the use of water from this pump in Broad Street in Soho, the Broad Street pump. What was interesting is when Bazalgette started laying out all the wonderful new sewers in London, the last little bit of London that wasn't actually fully equipped with sewers was the East End of London around Whitechapel. And there in 1866, because there wasn't clean water, another cholera epidemic broke out, nearly 6,000 deaths at that time. The significance of that will become apparent in a moment. But obviously, that really was, in some ways, an experiment to demonstrate that Snow's original observation in Soho absolutely bore out when you cleaned up the rest of the water in London, had a small pocket that wasn't clean, and then you ended up in this outbreak. And of course, as always in these circumstances, it is the poor, underprivileged, as this cartoon demonstrates, who get the hardest hit. And of course, that was an extremely poor part of London at that time. So air pollution, as you can see here in these pictures in the 1950s, is another public health issue which underwent a massive intervention in the mid-50s. And here, of course, we've got the Great London Fog of December 1952 that some of you on the call will remember. I certainly remember it, even though I wasn't living in London at the time, I was in Manchester. But still, we used to get these terrible so-called pea soup as smog, similar to that demonstrated in these photographs. And the work at the MRC unit at the St Bartholomew's Hospital at that time, shown in the bottom right-hand corner, was able to demonstrate that the death rate that was very severe over about 3 to 5 days in London at that time was paralleled, or just a bit preceded by, an increase in black carbon, soot, and sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere. And those are the yellow and the second peak from the bottom, showing how closely those two lines match. You'll also see that the line showing the deaths, certainly at the end of 15 days in December, still hadn't finished. And in fact, a total of nearly 12,000 people were thought to have died as a consequence of this single, very unpleasant episode, because many people died several months after the episode had passed. So this was a definitive proof, really, that air pollution was a driver of really severe health problems. And of course, all relates to the burning of coal, largely domestic coal, as it turns out, although industrial coal was important here. And we had the Clean Air Act of 1956 that came in, and you can see in that newspaper cutting the effect it had on the death rates, which was dramatic. And on the right-hand side, Robert Waller, working at St Bartholomew's MRC unit there, recorded across 3 or 4 months the smoke levels, the smoke in the atmosphere, the black carbon across that period of time. And you can see the top line was in 1952 and the bottom 1954 to 1955, before the Clean Air Act came in 1956, and then in 1969 1970 is the line at the bottom, and you can see how much it dramatically changed when people moved to smokeless fuel. Well, air pollution, of course, still remains an issue, and we'd all thought it had gone away until about, I suppose, the mid-1980s. We had the episode, you recall, of the acid rain in the early 1970s, but that was thought to be largely an environmental issue of sulfur dioxide related to the power stations in the United Kingdom dropping acid rain on Scandinavia, and that created quite a big political furore. But the human health side wasn't really a major issue that was concentrated on. But what's happened since is that we've got a completely different type of air pollution, and that relates largely to a different anthropogenic source, this time the burning of liquid fossil fuels rather than solid fossil fuels by various vehicles. You can see on the left some of the graphs of the continued upward trend of the small and large vehicles that utilize our roads in the United Kingdom. This only takes us up to 2019, and I'm sure if we had recent data on vans and light commercial vehicles following COVID, we'll see that that line would have gone up rather more steeply currently. So we're on this journey of filling up our lovely little island with metal machines with internal combustion engines under the bonnets of those machines, and emitting out of the tailpipe in those vehicles chemical substances, which can be largely broken down as to primary pollutants or secondary pollutants. The primary pollutants, the ones that come directly out of the pipe of an internal combustion engine. The secondary pollutants are chemical reactions occurring in the atmosphere, not only involving obviously fossil fuel emissions, but also more recently involving emissions from farmland, with ammonia and nitrate playing an important part in the secondary pollutants. But it's the vehicle emissions which are thought to be important. And this got real recognition in 2018. It's surprising how long this took, actually, but the World Health Organization recognized at their conference in October in 2018 the importance of air pollution causing adverse health. And you can see in that pie chart looking at non-communicable diseases that airborne particles and active and passive smoking on a worldwide scale were approximately equivalent in their ability to affect humans with severe adverse health and death. And that really is quite a depressing statistic. And this had largely gone unnoticed up until this time, which is a little bit surprising. Why it's surprising, I think, is probably due to the fact that we can't see, smell, or taste modern air pollution unless it's very high indeed. It's the small particles, of course, which we're largely talking about here, but also oxides of nitrogen. Here we have a picture of a human hair showing the particles called PM10. These are particles 10 micrometers or less in diameter, the blue circles on a human hair, and then the ones that we're more concerned about, which are the even smaller ones, the PM2.5, the little red ones. And you can see how very small these are. And when we get down to these levels, and there's a scanning electron micrograph picture of the particles you can see in the picture there at the top above PM10, then we start to get some really serious problems arising. And even more so shown on the right-hand bottom side of this slide, when we get to the so-called ultrafine particles. These are the ones where we're now in the nanoparticle size range, where particles are behaving like gases, and they start to have emergent properties which change the characteristic of how the particle works. And when they get down to this size, they carry charge on their surface that repel each other, meaning that they stay suspended in the air for long periods of time. And also, as you can see there, on the surface of these particles, where there is an exponential increase in surface area in proportion to mass, you can see that various chemicals are deposited from internal combustion engines, but also from other sources as well. And these are the chemicals that we're being exposed to, and these are the chemicals we cannot see. And we can see now, as you can see, this European Commission news alert in April of 2021, that these very small particles are linked to millions of global premature deaths every year. And what we need to do is identify the source and do something about it. This is a fairly recent study, about a year old, using the global exposure mortality model, which takes many millions of people, as well as air pollution exposure on a geographic scale, and estimates that about 8.8 million people a year are dying excessively from being exposed to air pollution. And that the lives lost in this area are getting close to those that we're losing from tobacco smoking. So this is a very serious issue indeed. And if only we could get rid of this anthropogenic air pollution and get it down to low levels, then we could save many people's lives and accelerate their survival into healthy older age. And this was why in 2016, when the president of the Royal College of Physicians, Sir Richard Thompson, at that time, asked me to chair a working party for the Royal College on air pollution to bring together the evidence base around health. We were able to do this with the help of reports such as those from COMEP and others, to be able to show that in the United Kingdom alone, we had at least 36,000 excess deaths a year. And recent statistics suggest it may even be double that as a result of air pollution exposure. The economics are very, very depressing, with around about £20 billion a year being lost each year in this country, and a whole range of diseases being accelerated or induced by these pollutants. And by that I mean there is hardly a single part of the human body that air pollution doesn't accelerate the progress of chronic disease within, whether it's the brain, the reproductive organs, the lung, or the cardiovascular system, the endocrine system, the skin, the eyes, the neurological system. So air pollution isn't just about lung exposure, it is about total body exposure, accelerating the aging process of these organs in human beings. Now, the depressing statistics around this is that our policy across the world in large part, but especially in the UK and Europe, has been driven largely by compromise. And on the left-hand side, you'll see a list of air quality limit values for the various pollutants I've just referred to, the particulate pollution at the top, ozone, nitrogen dioxide, etc. And showing the number or the proportion of the population living in Europe that are exposed to illegal levels, that is exceeding the limit values. You'll see relatively few people are exposed to illegal levels of pollution in Europe. But these are not health limits. These are compromise limits that the government's arrived at by trade-off. On the right-hand side, we have the World Health Organization limit values. And you can see here that a high proportion of the European population are living in illegal levels of air pollution. And especially true of PM2.5 and some of the other vehicle emissions, meaning that for the children whom I'm going to be talking about in a minute, there is a tremendous number of these children who are being exposed to these toxic chemicals, which are obviously influencing their life course and increasing their vulnerability and susceptibility to non-communicable diseases. And if we look at some of these really big studies, I've only chosen one here, there's some big European ones of many tens of millions as well. We can see, plotting on the left-hand side, the hazard ratio against the particulate pollution along the horizontal axis in over 60 million Medicare beneficiaries in the United States. You can see that the death rate relationship to the particulate pollution is a linear one and passes through 1. Since the hazard ratio is a log scale, that means it's zero. In other words, there is no safe limit of air pollution, and that all levels of air pollution create toxicity. And on the right-hand side, you see similar figures for ozone, and we have figures for NO2 and the other pollutants as well. So the conclusions of this study, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, was that there are no concentrations that are safe of air pollutants, number one. But importantly, and very relevant, I think, to current existence, that it's racial minorities and people of low income that are exposed to the greatest concentrations of these pollutants. I'm going to come back to that again in a few moments. So what is it in the air in particular that is driving this accelerated disease acquisition and the more rapid progress of NCDs? Well, several large studies have been investigating this, looking at the components in the air that seem to be driving the toxicology of air pollution in particular. And we're concentrating here on the PM2.5, the 2.5 micrometers or less particles. And it's those emitted from fossil fuel that seem to be, in the world stage, the greatest driver of this adverse health. And we can see here that as we get the levels lower, the relationship between these small particles and the morbidity and mortality caused by them becomes steeper rather than shallower. In other words, again, as we get to really low levels of these pollutants, they are remaining toxic. So we've really got to drive the levels down much lower than currently is the situation. I need to just remind you that the European levels, the limit values for PM2.5 in the United Kingdom is 25 micrograms per meter cubed. So I'll be coming back to that figure again in a few moments. Even as far back as 2012, the UK Air Quality Expert Group that advises DEFRA on its air pollution policy said that we need to get closer to the chemical composition of these particles to know which of the components we need to target in terms of reducing this terrible morbidity and mortality. Well, in fact, we've known this for quite a while. I mean, some of my early research back in 1999, showed on the left-hand side just a few minutes of a normal healthy person being exposed to diesel emissions at the levels found in a busy tunnel going along a motorway. You can see that the neutrophils, the inflammation in the airways as a direct result of that exposure is very substantial indeed. That even normal people are reacting to these chemicals in a very pro-inflammatory pathway. And a series of publications on the right, which I won't go through, shows that we've shown not identical, but similar sorts of inflammatory response produced by these pollutants, particles, oxides of nitrogen, and ozone, all of which contribute to the adverse inflammatory effects that pollution is causing in these different human diseases. I was asked in 1995, as a result of one or two episodes of air pollution and hospital admissions that had been noticed in that previous year, 1994, to try and come up with some ways that we could maybe reduce or at least find out more about why air pollution, this new air pollution, was causing a problem. And as you can see, over a period here of over 10 years, of over 5 or 6 years, we published several reports that started to identify particulates as being a really serious problem in air pollution, both short-term and long-term. We identified asthma as being a particular disease area that needed attention. And we identified in 2011 the need to be able to warn the public so that they knew what to do about this, and came up with an air quality index. But it's interesting looking back now. Back in 2006, I had the good fortune of being a member of the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, and we published a report called The Urban Environment then. And it's interesting looking back what we said in 2006, and you can see that Further measures to reduce traffic levels of pollution in hotspots in towns and cities and to bear down heavily on the most polluting vehicles was what we were saying then. To promote the concept of exposure reduction by reducing overall health impacts of outdoor air pollution on the whole population. And finally, to raise awareness in terms of the public and those that are polluting of the importance of cleaning up the air and trying to change the way that vehicles moved around and that we traveled in them. So even then in 2006, we were saying things about, well, look, we've got enough evidence now to say we need to make substantial changes. So let me just take a step back again before I pick this up, this theme up in terms of policy, and think a bit more about what is driving the adverse health effects. What is it about these little particles, about nitrogen dioxide, about ozone, that really is causing these acceleration in these diseases? And I think the general consensus now, it's not 100% proven, but it's largely proven, that it's oxidant stress which is the driver. And we as human beings are protected in our lungs and our tissues against oxidant stress by a variety of enzymes, by a variety of vitamins and other chemicals in our bodies that prevent oxidant stress from damaging tissues. But as we ramp up the exposure to these different chemicals, we breach these antioxidant defenses and we start to see tissue damage. And this is meant to be a picture of lining epithelial cells in the lungs, ciliated epithelial cells. And you can see that in the left-hand side that the epithelium is pretty well protected at low levels. We're able to tolerate air pollution and mop up the oxidant radicals. But as the oxidant radicals continue to hit the epithelial cells, we transit through the inflammatory pathways into cell death and tissue damage. And that journey from being protected against pollution to having tissue damage is the one we're really concerned about, because age, genetic predisposition, and pre-existing disease, particularly the NCDs, the non-communicable diseases, all mop up these pollutant protective pathways, making people more vulnerable to the adverse health effects of exposure to particles and other pollutants. And if we look at a map of Europe here, we've got, this is using satellite imagery, which is quite a nice way of doing things, but also using chemistry to try and help us understand the toxicology. On the left-hand side at the top, you can see the European distribution of PM10, measured purely as particles. And you can see that Western Europe and parts of Spain and the UK have got pretty high levels. And in the bottom, we've got a chemical assay as to the proportion of the particle which is oxidant in its capacity. And they use a chemical called DDT to find this. And you can see that the distribution is starting to change now, and that it's the industrial parts of the European community where we're getting higher levels of these oxidant damaging pollutants. Then in the top right-hand side, we're looking at the sources of the PM10, and the purple represents the secondary pollutants, largely coming from agricultural practices, ammonia and nitrate and sulfate. The blue, the pale blue, is crustal exposure, but in the bottom, the green and the black is the exposure coming from anthropogenic activity, from vehicle use, from internal combustion, from friction of brakes and friction of tyres on roads. And you can see that the UK and northern France there are particularly affected by this. And these are the toxic chemicals which are really causing the issue. And so if it is the oxidative potential of chemicals in the atmosphere that are damaging us, surely we should be trying to measure this rather than just counting beans. We are, after all, in the 2021s now, not in the 1900s. So just counting beans is not really telling us about the toxic injury. And this has very particular meaning to me because I spent my career researching asthma, and I don't want to bore you with a lot of the details, but many of you will know that asthma is an inflammatory disease and we treat it with inhaled steroids, and we treat the acute bronchospasm by giving bronchodilators. But one of the things that came out of the research I've been doing in the last 20, 30 years was that in addition to this inflammation, which is in some ways very similar to the allergic pathways, on the right-hand side of that bottom diagram, we've got this injury pathway, this epithelial damage. And we worked out that, in fact, in asthma, it's a disease where we have a chronic wound of the airways, that the airways are more vulnerable to environmental insult, to viruses, to pollutants, to cold air, to exercise, to other stimuli. Hence, the way an asthmatic airway responds differently from a normal airway. So it's not just about inflammation that we treat with inhaled steroids, but it's about the injury and repair response that makes the airway susceptible to the environment. And this is the aspect that I spent quite a bit of my career researching on. Those environmental factors shown in the top frame, pollen exposure, dust mite exposure, pet exposure, viral infection, stimulation by cold air and exercise, and of course, chemical fumes and air pollution. So these are the stimuli that makes asthma a lot worse. And what's happened really in the last 15 years, as shown in the bottom frame, is that these different components, the allergens, the viruses, the air pollutants, come together, and they not only trigger acute attacks of asthma, shown on the right-hand side as exacerbations, but they're heavily involved in the induction of asthma in the first place. And this is one of the reasons why asthma across the world is going up progressively on the world scale, is because these various environmental insults are having more presence in the airways. And we can see the impact of this in various studies. I mean, epidemiology is the public health physician's tool in some ways. And this incredible study in California shows that by reducing air pollution, which is being undertaken in California, and looking at 3 ways of children through the different levels of air pollution they were exposed of over 8 years, there was an incredible benefits in terms of not only incident asthma that these kiddies were developing in California, but also the exacerbations of asthma that they were experiencing. So that's an intervention study, which I think has a lot to commend it. This is another study in Vancouver where they looked at incident asthma across 10 years, looking at a birth cohort, looking at how air pollution might induce asthma in children that otherwise would not have developed it, by doing this longitudinal study. And they looked at a large number of cases, and as you can see here, for nitric oxide, nitrogen dioxide, and carbon monoxide, they were able to show that there was enhanced development of asthma, particularly in babies that were had low birth weights, which again is a pollution outcome, that they developed asthma preferentially when exposed to higher levels of pollution. And then this massive study that was reported really relatively recently in the Lancet Planet Health, which looked at multiple countries, 194 countries, looking at 215 as an incident year, and looking at air pollution in relation to new asthma development in children. And they were able to show that air pollution was responsible for 4 million new cases of asthma in children across the world, most of which were occurring, or high majority were occurring, in urban centres, which is what we've been saying, and it accounts for 13% of incident asthma. So this is really not a trivial effect on human health, and it's only one disease we're talking about here. This latest study, looking at all Danish children born between 1997 and 2014, undertook a similar sort of study looking at hazard ratios with a different range of pollutants measured in that country. And they were able to show again that new asthma was occurring along with persistent wheezing when compared to those not exposed to pollutants. And that this was at least as great as maternal smoking and having genetic parental asthma in terms of driving the onset of new disease. So these other risk factors amounted to similar effects to those being experienced with air pollution. And we often think of Denmark as being a clean country. So we're talking here about exposures, obviously, which are not visible and are not absolutely astronomically high. So we need to remind ourselves now where we are in the UK. 8 million people, 12% of the population, have been diagnosed with asthma in the UK. Recent BMJ article has emphasised that. We have one of the worst asthma death rates in Europe. Rates of people dying of asthma have increased by more than 20% over the last 5 years in this country. The data shows that 1,400 people died from asthma in 2018, going up progressively, as you can see, since the previous year. And over a decade, over 12,500 people have died from asthma. So although we often think of asthma as a trivial disease treated with bronchodilator inhaled steroids, we are talking here about a very serious issue affecting a population of people who are young and active. And this was one of the reasons, really, I took on the case of Ella Kissi-Debrah in producing, over a period of 2 years, medical evidence trying to look at why she died prematurely from her asthma, which was absolutely devastating. Her mother, Rosamund Kissi-Debrah, as you can see at the bottom here, has had a tireless campaign over the last 7 years trying to get interest in trying to understand why Ella died at the age of 9 in 2013 of asthma after only 3 years of having the disease. So getting involved in this case was a real experience for me. And we were able to assemble over a period of about 15 months, looking at 6 hospitals records, GP records, measurements of air pollution in the southeast part of London she lived, that we could make a case that spikes of nitrogen dioxide and PM10 and PM2.5 could in fact be contributing to, or was in fact contributing, not only to Ella's terrible asthma, which I shall explain in a minute, but also to her death, which of course was important. And we were able to convince in our evidence that we presented to the coroner and then to the Attorney General that the inquest of little Ella should be reopened. And let me just show you why. This just shows you 3 months of air pollution measurements in and around Ella, where she lived in southeast London. The top grey line there is nitrogen dioxide, and the 2 lines underneath that are the PM10 and the PM2.5. And then the one at the bottom is ozone. And you can see that the vertical lines in orange with the little boxes are descriptions of catastrophic cardiovascular and respiratory collapse that Ella experienced across several months during this period, leading to her emergency admission to one of 6 hospitals in London. When she arrived there, almost invariably she had to be resuscitated and admitted to intensive care unit and ventilated. And in the grey line, you can see beneath the grey line, there's a dotted line which shows the air quality air quality limit value for NO2 for the UK. And you can see for large parts of October through to December 2011, Ella was exposed to illegal levels of nitrogen dioxide and pretty high levels of particulates at certain times during that month as well. Now we're moving into spring, and you can see a dramatic thing changing. Firstly, you can see that the NO2 levels in and around where she lived dropped really quite dramatically, that the ozone level was beginning to increase a little bit as we're getting into this warmer weather and the summer, but her asthma attacks and her devastating asthma was starting to drop off. Such that by the time we got into the summer, you can see here that she hardly had any asthma at all. And in fact, the air pollution levels for NO2 and for the other air pollution levels were almost always within legal limits. So this was a very dramatic picture, and one might immediately ask the question, well, how do you know it was air pollution that might have been driving her asthma? Well, if we look at the pollen count, Ella was allergic to grass pollen. She was allergic, had very low allergic reactions to dog, but to no other allergens, not to dust mite, not to cat, not to fungi, to none of the winter allergens. So the classical allergy that causes asthma in the winter months that most children are allergic to could not have accounted for her really severe attacks across that time frame, and certainly the pollen exposure, as you can see there, was not accounting for her attacks. So it's very unlikely that her episodes were directly related to allergen exposure. The second was infection, and of course we all know that bad asthma can be triggered by virus infections, particularly common cold viruses, influenza, and a variety of respiratory viruses, as well as certain bacteria on occasions and fungi. We could find no evidence in the records, despite test after test after test in all of these hospitals, that any of these organisms were driving these acute exacerbations and her emergency admissions for asthma. Then there was this white blood cell response, not only in her blood, but also in her bronchoalveolar lavage, and later, as I was to find out in her post-mortem findings, that she had this incredible inflammatory reaction in her airways that was very much like an irritant reaction. She had lining cells of her airways present in the mucus secretions, and those lining cells indicated that they were under toxic stress. They were being damaged, similar to what I was describing earlier with the oxidant stress. So she has severe irritation of her airways. And if we look at when she was getting her attacks, and remember she was in and out of hospital nearly 30 times in just under 3 years, by far the majority of her attacks shown in the table on the right occurred in the autumn-winter months. And you can see what the air pollution levels were like in her area of London during the autumn and across the summer. And you can see that during the winter and autumn months, the air pollution levels were much higher in January compared to the summer. So again, it's building this evidence base that it was air pollution that was the chemical irritant driving all of this. And of course, Ella came from a family where there was a very strong genetic risk of developing asthma, and 2 of her siblings in fact have asthma as well. So we were looking at a strong genetic base. And what I was able to conclude over a period of nearly 2 years, analysing the data sets from her records and the air pollution measurements locally, was that she had an unusual form of asthma. It wasn't a classical bronchospasm. She had asthma that led to this incredible outpouring of mucus, such that she was drowning in her own secretions, and that this was clustering across the winter months, leading to these episodes, often 5 or 6 of them, in a period of 5 or 6 weeks, leading to her emergency admission to hospital. And she would frequently come in with partially collapsed lungs as a direct result of the mucus blocking her airways. And in the diagram on the right, I've tried to actually describe that in a diagram, showing that the damage to the epithelium, she had such incredible epithelial damage that her nerves and her mucus secreting cells were being activated, causing this intractable cough and this terrible syncope, hypoxia, and respiratory arrest that would characterize her asthma. So this was a very unusual form of asthma. I'm not trying to say it wasn't, but she had 30 of these at least across 3 years, and how frightening and what a terrible situation that must have been. And obviously the coroner was persuaded that there was an association between air pollution and these devastating clusters of attacks. And I've listed there some of the conclusions. I've not tried to change the wording he used in his report. They're exactly the wording he used when he issued his inquest report on December the 16th last year. And you can see he was attributing not only the episodes of asthma that Ella was having, including her unfortunate death, but also the induction of her asthma to air pollution exposure. And that's the death certificate, which is the first in the UK as far as we know, and probably the first in the world where air pollution has appeared on a death certificate. And hence, this is a landmark case. And the coroner Philip Barlow said that there are learnings here for other people and other cases. And of course, we've known that asthma kills people. We've also known that air pollution and asthma kills people. I mean, here's a very nice study conducted in China. Often we can't get studies like this because we can't get the numbers up. But here they've looked at 4,500 people in the COVID area of China, the Hubei province, and shown really remarkable links between air pollution exposure and death from asthma across a variety of age groups. And so in terms of a child, we've got to be thinking about, well, look, if we've got this terrible asthma in Britain, which we have, we've got death from asthma occurring in Britain, which we have, we've got a very good medical profession with inhaled steroids and bronchodilators, which we have. There's got to be something else that's driving why Britain is so bad on the asthma front. And this takes me back now to how asthma begins. And of course, I did say from the epidemiological studies that the early life origins of asthma were probably important here. And to be able to demonstrate now that air pollution, particularly particles, these PM10 and PM2.5 particles are shown in the top frame, can get inside cells, inside of the placenta, in pregnant women living in air polluted areas, and being able to see in the bottom left-hand side the chemical composition of those particles, showing the presence here of zinc particles, for example, but also calcium particles in the placenta suggests an external source of this. But I think game, set and match came from this particular study conducted in the United States. And here they were looking at black carbon in the placenta of women exposed to different levels of pollution in the United States. And they were able to demonstrate on the right-hand side that the higher the level of exposure to the pollutants, the greater the number of particles in the placenta of these pregnant women. But more importantly, these particles were found on the fetal side of the circulation rather than the maternal side. In other words, they were getting across the placenta and actually able to gain access to the fetus directly. And this really then, of course, leads us to think about how the environment is shaping the organs in these fetuses for developing diseases like asthma, and epigenetic gene bioenvironmental interactions are likely to be important here. And I've listed a number of publications there pointing to this. And if air pollution can get it into the placenta and across it, this becomes a real possibility. And here we have a very nice review really as to how the environment and the mother, the placenta and the fetus interact towards developing small babies for dates, poorly developed lungs, and more recently impaired development of brains in babies too, in the fact that the oxidant stress distorts the morphogenesis of the lung, shown in the left-hand side here, and we lose on average about 1.5 generations of airways in babies born of mothers in highly polluted areas, even in places like London, with loss of lung function, which many of you all know in relation to that, but also shaping the immune system, helping the immune system towards a more allergic phenotype and a more pro-inflammatory, pro-asthmatic status. So gradually now we're beginning to get some answers, thank goodness. But it didn't stop Philip Barlow from really saying something quite powerful in his Prevention of Future Deaths report from Ella Kissi-Debrah's death. Firstly, he said, we've really got to work towards getting to the health-related air quality limit values. We can no longer tolerate 25 micrograms per meter cubed in this country, which is killing many people and affecting the trajectory of our young people. We've got to raise awareness to help individuals reduce their exposure to air pollution, but more importantly, we've got to get industry and everywhere else in society behind this campaign to try and change the way we emit these terrible chemicals. And thirdly, we've got to help the health and medical profession to understand the consequences of air pollution, remembering that in all the time that Ella Kissi-Debrah had those 30 hospital admissions, not once was air pollution ever mentioned by any of her medical practitioners. And I'm not blaming anybody here, it's just the knowledge just wasn't in there. So the time has come, I think. We've got to recognise air pollution now as a major public health threat. We can no longer just sit by and let the machinery all around us continue to damage human health in the way that it's doing and preventing our young people having healthy lives. We're at a unique moment now. We've got we've got net zero, on a threshold to get down the burning of fossil fuels in our vehicles. We've got the adaptation we could really kind of build upon with COVID we've just been through. We've got the Environment Bill, which is coming through in November. We've got to really change the behaviour in the way people view air pollution, like we did with passive cigarette smoking a few years ago. I, in particular, feel quite strongly that the medical and health professions have got to stand up now and start saying something more about this than they have in the past. And that's really the reason why I kind of volunteered to work with this new SPF, this Strategic Priorities Fund called the Clean Air SPF, to get new research done in Britain. We've got £42.5 million worth of networks, consortia, various programs filling in the gaps on indoor and outdoor air pollution. So we will work with all of them to try and get the evidence base. But basically we have this task to really work on. We've got to get over the communication barriers between those that measure pollution and those that manage the diseases that are caused by pollution. And there's a big gap here between the health profession and the atmospheric scientists. We've got to get the health community to take ownership of some of this and not pretending it's somebody else's business. And we did that with passive cigarette smoking very effectively. We've got to get the messaging over to the public in a more positive manner, that they can do things to make a difference and take away the negative motivation for behaviour change. We've got to promote innovations, obviously, that are going to help clean up the air, and things are happening around us to do that. And we've got to prevent the industrial pushback saying that cleaning up the air means low jobs and unemployment, because it doesn't. It means new jobs and re-employment and a healthier environment for us all to live. Remember, the PM10, PM2.5 limits of 25 micrograms per metre cubed in Britain at the moment. The WHO guidelines are 10 micrograms per metre cubed. So you can imagine, just by reducing by 1 microgram per metre cubed, listing there the number of diseases that we can influence. So imagine what it would be like if we got the whole population down to 10 micrograms per metre cubed. There'd be hundreds of thousands of cases of illness affected by that change. So my last slide really is to say, look, we must clean up the air. It's our responsibility to do so. We've got to create the behaviour changes to do that. We've got to make people feel it's normal to want to clean up the air, and we've got to make people feel powerful in doing so. In other words, to take the negative narrative away from this whole field. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Sir Stephen. That was absolutely outstanding. You know, the passion of which you spoke to us, but also some of the very simple, easy messaging that we could be really inspired about and become part of your army to try and take these messages forward. And really the very tender way you talked about Ella Kissi-Debrah, and actually the way in which you helped and exposed and ensured that that evidence came to light. It really was breathtaking. So thank you so much for a really outstanding and powerful presentation. Colleagues, shall we show our thanks to Stephen by doing a round of applause? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. That's really
Not quite as powerful, Stephen, in the virtual world, but
yeah.
nevertheless.
I can't hear myself think.
Thank you. And as my youngest daughter had very brittle and very severe asthma, so you touched a lot in my personal life with that presentation. Thankfully, all sorted now, but it was a very difficult time. Yeah. So I have sympathy.
Thank you.
There are a few questions, Stephen, if you would give us some more of your time to answer those. Would that be okay?
So I'm going into the Q&A.
Yes. The first one is coming up as an anonymous attendee. I don't know if that colleague would like to speak out, or if we can't get that, would you mind answering that question about the paradoxical effects?
Yeah, well, of course, air pollution is going to be just one factor in these complex diseases. I'm not trying to pretend that air pollution is the cause of multiple diseases. And I think in that list that you put in your question, we have to think about those that are disenfranchised, the inequalities, because all NCDs are high in that group. So we're talking about obesity, coronary vascular disease, dementia, hypertension, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, etc., etc., etc. And air pollution is feeding into all of that, just as obesity feeds into all of that. And I think, you know, these are wicked problems, as the social scientists tell us. There's going to be no single solution to this. But we've got to move society, I think, in the right direction here. And I think a good start will be to generate a much more positive narrative that by cleaning up the air and cleaning up the environment, our lives would improve generally. And it isn't all about pain and having to buy expensive cars and all the rest of it. It's about liberating the streets, enabling us to claim back our urban environments again where we can live, rather than having it taken over by machines that are burning fossil fuels. I think in a way, COVID-19 shone an incredible light on what it's like to have a quieter, more nature-focused environment around us during that first lockdown. We're obviously rebounding back from that now, but it's all attainable. It's all doable if the will is there.
Thank you, Sir Stephen. And I think because of the technology, I'm going to read Samia Latif's next question out. Do we have comparative data on air pollution and health during the pandemic when traveling considerably reduced globally?
Yeah, so we're going to have those data, which is going to be very important. And certainly the unit at Imperial College is collecting all those statistics. We do know that NO2 dropped dramatically, particularly in central London, but it did in some of the other cities as well. Particulates less so, but what was interesting about the particulates is that they were more secondary particulates during that first lockdown. Remember, we had that easterly wind blowing in the pollution from across Poland and eastern Germany that was bringing in this air pollution. But what we don't know, of course, is the relative toxicity of those particles. And that's why I was saying we need to know more about the toxicology of the different particle subtypes. But yes, and certainly the statistics that came out of recently published by the British Lung Foundation and Asthma Campaign Coalition suggest that patients with asthma definitely benefited during that period, which is quite the opposite, of course, to what we've been experiencing with COVID.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much indeed. And the next couple of questions, we've got two from Carol Brain and one from Jonathan Shepherd. Now that really pleases me because Carol and Jonathan were working with me on the judging panel for the selection of the Bazalgette Professorship. So I don't know that Carol's able to get into the actual, be able to speak here. So shall I read out the question and then you can answer it for the benefit of the participants? So Carol's first question is the nature of the asthma the same as earlier generational asthma, that is, has the disease phenotype fundamentally changed even though it has the same label in medical records?
Oh, what a wonderful question, Carol. I mean, you know, I ought to have my career again now, I think, really. It has changed and is changing. It is quite remarkable. We're looking now, particularly at late onset asthma, people who've been exposed to these pollutants for most of their adult life, these new pollutants, we're getting much more non-allergic, intrinsic asthma, as we used to call it in the old days. And the type of inflammation I described in Ella's case is becoming more prominent in the asthma we're seeing now, with a mixed leukocyte response, less eosinophilic and mast cell response. So yes, asthma is changing, and that's because the environment is changing. So I think you're spot on, and I do think we're going to need to do what you've said in your question, is to recategorize asthma in a different way. Going to the other end of the spectrum, in young children, it looks as if asthma is having an earlier onset now. So often we say asthma doesn't really start until you're over 3 years of age. Well, that actually is not the case anymore. And babies as young as 2 or 3 months of age are expressing permanent wheezing phenotypes. So again, down at that end of the spectrum, it's changing. And that may be something to do with the pregnancy or for the first 6 months of life. So yes, it is. And I think it's, well, it's certainly keeping us in the asthma field fairly busy as to know where we take this next.
Thank you. And Carol's next question is, does the knowledge about nanoparticles have any implications for our understanding of potential harms from the research that is focused on nanoparticles for potential beneficial uses?
Yeah, well, it does. And in fact, you know, a lot of the biology of how these small particles in their own right, not in terms of being Trojan horses for chemicals, but in their own right, can cause problems. But I think really in the air pollution arena, at least, it is that Trojan horse bit, the carrying of the chemicals into the cell on the back of these particles, which is where the real concern lies. And I think if I just may, Maggie, on this point, one of the things that came up in Ella Kissi-Debrah's inquest was the concentration on various chemicals or on particles. But in fact, when you think about diesel emissions, of which we use NO2 as a surrogate marker of, nearly 10,000 different chemicals are associated with that NO2. So the NO2 really is only a marker of traffic pollution. It doesn't say it's causing the disease itself. And I think this is where a lot of confusion is created when atmospheric scientists don't properly communicate with the health and the medical community, because they tend to interpret the particle or the NO2 as being the toxic substance, whereas the chances are that it isn't, that it's part of it, but it isn't the whole story.
Thank you very, very much indeed. I'm going to squeeze in the question from Jenny Mendel before I go to Jonathan Shepherds. So Jenny's asking if Sir Stephen could work with the Faculty of Public Health. I think you're a very esteemed Fellow of the Faculty, delighted to be working with you, to create a set of slides that Directors of Public Health and others can use with colleagues, policymakers, practitioners and other disciplines, and perhaps the public. So obviously, Sir Stephen, we will use the video from this event with your slides and put that out in our e-bulletin, but perhaps you could respond to that if there's a way that we can follow up with you, because you had some really powerful information. And the bit I liked best was that small change that we could make just by reducing one
microgram per meter cube.
That's
could
exactly,
save tens of
yes.
thousands of lives. Yeah.
Let alone 10. What 10 could do would be extraordinary. But I would even say, let's start with 1 microgram.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's a wonderful suggestion. Thank you so much for making it. And we certainly would be more than pleased to help you with that. And the Global Action Plan, which is an NGO, are developing materials. The Royal College of Physicians, as you will know, came forward with a fabulously ambitious plan to help health professionals get more engaged with the air pollution agenda. So yes, we can involve them as well. And certainly as Clean Air Champions and with the new iteration of Public Health England, we will be very keen indeed to develop such an educational resource for you. Yes.
That's fantastic.
With you, not for you, with you.
With
no,
you,
I didn't mean
yes.
for you, I meant with you.
Thank you so much, Sir Stephen. And Jenny very kindly has volunteered to help.
Thank you.
We were very privileged as a faculty to sit alongside and work with our colleagues in RCP to get that tool developed. So that's excellent.
Great.
So moving now on to Jonathan's question. Jonathan's very interested in how you got involved in Ella's case and the advocacy which followed. You've shared a bit of that with us. Is it possible you could share a bit more?
Yeah, well, I could in a way. I've got to be a little careful here because we've got, you know, a little girl who died, and there's a lot of personal stuff with Ella's family, which I don't want to talk about today. But I think that the main thing really was the fact that we had somebody in Rosamond who was a mother who was just not going to take no for an answer. And, you know, she deserves so much credit for that. Bit like Stephen Lawrence's mother in a way, that incredible, I don't know, resolve to turn a tragedy into something that's going to be a wider public benefit. And she's said throughout and declared at the inquest, she's not apportioning blame to anybody here. This is about creating change. So that's point one. And point two, I mean, my career around viruses, allergy and air pollution was a natural fit for the natural history of this little girl's asthma. So when Rosamond, through her lawyers, approached me and tried a number of other doctors who didn't feel they could take it on, I said, well, this is actually, you know, describing a 40-year career. I could sit down now and use all the stuff that I've collected over 40 years and do something with it. And so produce this 56-page report for the coroner, and it was a pleasure to do it. It took nearly 2 years to complete because there was a lot of data to go through. But I have to say, you know, it's hard not to want to do something when you meet somebody like Rosamond. You know, she is a woman who is quite somebody, and I've got so much admiration for her.
Well, thank you so very much. And we've got Greg Fells actually given us 2 questions. So his first question is around how we actually bring the reframing of this with government departments, because obviously he's put in the question and answer, the consequences are the NHS and obviously to lives, but then there's DEFRA, DFT, HMT, whole government, whole societal problem. Yeah. He's also looking for a silver bullet, some sort of magic bullet.
Thank you.
That could, if there's one action.
Well, thank you for that. Well, just let's think a little bit about where the legal responsibilities in government sit for air pollution. And they sit firmly with the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Now, the reason why it sits there was because of what happened in the 1970s and 80s with the acid rain. And of course, it was an environmental issue then. It was about, you know, killing trees in Norway due to acid rain. But now we need health to take the center stage here, and it hasn't. And that is part of the problem with all of this, is that we haven't got that health buy-in. The community hasn't said we must have health, take ownership of what is a public health problem and not an environment problem as it was in the 1970s. And that's why I'm really appealing to the faculty and others to try and lobby government through their members of parliament, through any other instrument, to try and get a greater representation of health on the agenda setting in this arena. To have it set by DEFRA is fine, providing we've got the right health people feeding into it. But if it's going to be the environment bill and it's going to be environment driving all of this, I worry that health's going to be put on the back burner, just as it's being put on the back burner for COP26 in November. And, you know, that is not good enough, I'm afraid. So that's why we need the professional bodies, Maggie, to really help now create a noise around this. I think we've got an ally now with a new director coming in to run the Health Safety Agency, I think it's called, which is the bit of FPHE that's going to be responsible for COVID as well as air pollution and chemicals in the environment. So I think having Jenny Harris as the chief executive there, who is obviously a deputy public health medical officer, a deputy chief medical officer, is a fantastic step forward. So let's get Jenny involved in this early, before a whole department gets formed, so that the health community get a firm foot in the door on this. Sorry, a long reply to a short question.
No, I very much welcome it, because I know when the coroner's report came out in relation to Ella, some health colleagues felt that they couldn't understand why they've been implicated. And it really brought home to me that we should, you know, we don't want to shy away from this. It's good that this is a health issue. It's important it's a health issue, and it gives it more validity for some people that are still in denial about the sort of climate change aspects. I think air quality is so important, at least to get people engaged in climate change. So I'm with you 100%. And when the faculty was asked to feed in to what the UK health security should be, you know, what would be its top priorities, I made it very clear that environmental health had to be part of it. And of course, that would include air pollution, which I have to say, I don't think has been done thoroughly enough in the past. So it's one thing that could really improve. So thank you so much for that, Sir Stephen. I'm going to move on now, if I may. There's a very interesting question from David Rose, and it's in relation to your presentation. He's suggesting that from what you seem to be suggesting, that not all PM 2.5 are equal. Do we know enough to begin to distinguish between particulates of agricultural origin, for example, and those from diesel engines?
Yeah, we do. And I think part of the problem, and thanks for the question, David, is the fact we've allowed toxicology as a subject to wither on the vine in the United Kingdom. And so while we've had good epidemiology, especially as it relates to air pollution, the toxicology of air pollution has really not been in there as we had in the sort of 70s, 80s and 90s, when we had all that stuff about sulfur dioxide and so on. So we've got to regrow the toxicology community, because only by regrowing them are we going to get the speciation necessary to understand which emitting sources we need to concentrate our efforts on. And in Manchester or in Southampton or in London, they may be different. And so by having a one-size-fits-all is clearly not going to be a sensible way forward here. We've got to try and understand the biology of the individual particulate subtypes to then, within different geographic areas, arm the local authorities and the schools and all the rest of it with the information that enables them to make the changes needed. But to try and get PM 2.5 down to 10, probably in many cities in this country, Maggie, is not going to be possible, because quite a high proportion of that particulate is non-toxic and is crustal in origin, being blown in from the deserts around the world and elsewhere. Furthermore, the secondary pollutants, the ammonium sulfate that's formed with agriculture, it's all bunched together at the moment as if it's the same pollutant, but it isn't. It's a soluble substance, so if you put ammonium sulfate on water, it dissolves. So it's not actually like the carbon metal particles that are coming out of polluting vehicles. So that's why I really feel we do need to have a rather much more concentrated effort to understand the speciation of the particulates, so that the sources can be focused upon much more clearly. So that's my answer. We've got 3 super sites, one in London, one in Birmingham, one in Manchester, that the Natural Environment Research Council have recently established, which are doing very, very detailed chemistry on the particulates that are coming in across the whole year. And it's just started in June of this year and will go on till June of next year to get the chemistry. So we understand then, going backwards like a detective would on DNA, to work out where it came from and where we need to put the emission controls.
Thank you. That makes a great deal of sense. And there's a sort of nice follow-up question to that from Woody Khan, who, as you'll see in the chat, is talking about his own experiences around schools and recognising that PM 2.5 wasn't very much focused on. And if you've got any advice about how we might inspire teachers, school nurses, parents, etc., in relation to that issue.
Yeah, well, thanks, Woody. That's a very good question. But you know, one of the most powerful voices I've learned about in this whole field are parents and children. They are amazing. You know, and when you start talking about children's health and children being injured and children actually not growing up with the right organs as a result of different exposures, local authorities have to listen. Because parents and children actually are the future generation, and unless they look after them, you know, it's a no-gamer. So I think getting parent groups together, getting schools, and schools have actually been really good, by the way. I'm not in the least bit critical of schools; they've been fabulous in forming local groups to lobby the local authorities and force them to say, look, we do not want cars outside our school with our engines running. We don't want children to be dropped off at school when their parents live only half a mile down the road, you know, and they can, I think, by their behaviour, change practice. And we've got some great examples of that around the UK already happening. But I just want to say, Woody, I mean, schools are phenomenal. So, you know, if we could use school power, if I could use that term, as we're going to use health and medical power, they work together very well.
Thank you. And again, another very good suggestion for us to take forward. And I think this will be our last question, Sir Stephen, and thank you so much for giving up so much of your time. Right. Claire's commented on a great talk. What are your thoughts around the use of air filtration devices in the workplaces, homes and care homes? I'm really interested in this because people kept trying to sell me these things when I worked at the local level. So I'd be very interested in your answer.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, if you're in China and you're in Beijing and you can look at the windows, you can actually see the pollution coming through around your windows in Beijing during an air pollution bad air, and we know how bad it is there, then you can understand wanting something to kind of clean up the air. But I think ventilation of spaces is what we need, but not ventilating from you know, a road just outside your house like Ella had with the South Circular only 25 meters from a front door, but ventilation at the back of the house or further away, which enables clean air to come in. And, you know, looking back, if you recall, back in the, well, you may not, but looking at some pictures back in the Victorian era, you know, this is how we used to run our homes. They were ventilated. You know, our homes leaked, the floor allowed air to come in from underneath, our windows were never tight fitting, and they were drafty, and we had to tolerate that. But nowadays, we're all going for tightening our homes, keeping in the heat and the dampness, allowing chemicals to accumulate in indoor spaces so that our children are exposed to ever increasing concentrations. And under those conditions, I think, you know, some form of extraction is needed. The problem with extraction, whether it's filters that are portable or filters built into housing, is that people tend to switch them off if they're too noisy, or the filters get clogged up, and that's the end of it. You've got, you know, nothing. So I think it's a fix, but it's not really the solution, is the way I'd like to put it. And what we need to do, and somebody asked for a silver bullet, you know, let's remove the internal combustion engine. That's what we need to do from everything.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a superb note to end on. We're hugely privileged to have had you present to us tonight, Sir Stephen. Colleagues have asked what next. So I think I've mentioned, I'll just mention again, that this presentation recording plus the slides will go out in the faculty's e-bulletin. I encourage everyone to read the bulletin. It goes out every month and it will be there. We'll also put it on the faculty website. And as Stephen is one of our esteemed fellows of the faculty, I know we will continue to work collaboratively together. So colleagues, can we show our appreciation to Sir Stephen with a round of applause and thank him for giving us this outstanding and inspiring presentation tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and it's a privilege and an honour to be able to speak about this topic, which I feel rather passionate about, as you probably gathered. So thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being such a superb Bazalgette Professor for the faculty. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
And thank you everyone for joining tonight. I know it's an amazingly busy time in public health. I know many of you have joined us for the AGM. I know many of you will be leaving this to carry on your work. I know Public Health England colleagues, this is the start of your consultation exercise today, and I know it's been a very challenging day for you. We're still dealing with the pandemic, and it's been wonderful to see colleagues from right across the UK join this presentation tonight. So thank you everyone. We really appreciate everything you do and all your support. And thank you so much, Sir Stephen Holgate, for the excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Maggie. Thank you.